I had always thought I knew my father. He was the quiet man who worked hard every day, the man who provided for our family without ever asking for recognition. He was the kind of father who didn't say much, but you always knew he loved you. We weren't close, not in the way some families are, but we had our moments. I thought that was enough. When he passed away, I thought I had said all the things I needed to say, that I had finally understood who he was after all those years. I thought I had come to terms with the grief and loss. But then, after the funeral, when the house was still and the world felt too quiet, I found it. A small, worn box tucked away in the back of his closet. At first, I thought it was just some old letters or papers, nothing important. But as I opened it, my hands shook. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in my father's handwriting. But they weren't for me. They weren't even for our family. And as I read through them, I realized my father had been carrying a secret so big, so life-altering, that it had shaped the man I thought I knew, yet I had never once suspected it existed. It was a side of him I had never seen, a piece of his past he kept hidden so well that not even my mother knew about it. And suddenly I felt like a stranger in my own life, looking at the man I'd called my father and realizing that I didn't truly know him at all. The more I read, the more I discovered. A love he had never spoken of, a life he had left behind, and a decision that had haunted him for years. It was as if my whole life with him had been a lie. Everything I thought was true was now in question. And the hardest part? I would never be able to ask him about it. The man I loved, the man I'd looked up to, was now gone, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. This is the story of the secret my father took to his grave, a secret that changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and the people we trust most. I grew up in a home where the walls never seemed to change, where the days bled into each other, quietly and steadily, like the ticking of a clock you don't notice until it stops. My father was a constant part of that rhythm, like the beat of a song you could never quite hear but always feel. His presence was solid, dependable, like the old oak tree in the backyard, never flashy, never needing attention, but always there, unmoving, enduring. I suppose I thought that was just who he was. I never questioned it, not really. We lived in a modest house, just on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that always smelled of something good cooking, and a small backyard with a swing set my father built for me when I was little. My mom would often talk about how they didn't have much when they first got married, how they built their life together from the ground up. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was ours. We had enough. We were fine. My father worked long hours as a mechanic. I remember the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor as he walked into the house after a long day. That sound meant he was home, and everything was okay. Even on the rough days, when I could tell he was tired or frustrated, he always came home. That was his way. He didn't talk about his day much, but he didn't need to. I knew when something was bothering him. It was the way he'd sit in his chair, rub the back of his neck, and stare at the wall like he was seeing something far away. I always wanted to ask what he was thinking, but I never did. It never felt right to pry, and deep down, I think I was afraid of what I might learn. Sometimes, the quiet spoke louder than words. I guess that's how I grew up, by accepting silence. It was just the way things were. My father was always there, always dependable, but always distant too. He had a way of keeping things to himself, of locking away his thoughts behind walls I couldn't see past. And I, being the child who had my own world to figure out, never questioned it. After all, I had my mom to talk to. She filled the gaps where my father's silence left holes. She was the one who showed me how to talk about feelings, how to express emotions, while my father just existed. And I thought that was okay. I thought that was enough. When I was younger, I noticed he wasn't as open with me as other fathers were with their children. There were no long heart-to-heart talks, no stories about his youth, no sharing of memories. Sure, he'd tell me the occasional funny tale from work, or maybe a story about one of his brothers, but they were always surface level, never anything deep. Never anything that made me feel like I truly knew who he was before he was my father, but I let it slide. I was a child, and children are supposed to be loved, not to understand everything. I used to think he loved me, though. I thought we had that bond, the kind where he would always be there for me, where I could lean on him when things went wrong. I was his daughter, after all. But now that I'm older, I can't help but think back and realize just how little I actually knew him. Sure, I knew his likes and dislikes, his favorite shows, the things that would annoy him, like when the neighbor's dog barked too loud. But I didn't know about the man he had been before me. I didn't know the things that weighed on him, the things he carried silently, in that faraway look in his eyes. As I got older, I began to ask myself questions. Who was he really? What did he dream about when he was young? What made him smile when no one was around? What made him sad? But when I tried to ask him, his answers were always vague. It was like he was trying to protect me from something. From what? I didn't know. But life continued. I moved out of the house when I turned 18. It wasn't that I was running away, it was just the natural course of things. I got a job, started a life of my own, and grew up. I had my own struggles, my own relationships, my own experiences, and every time I visited home, I would see my father as I always had, distant, quiet, but present. I would sit across from him at the kitchen table, talk about my life, my job, my friends, but he would mostly listen, offering only the occasional comment. It never felt like a conversation. More like a series of monologues with me as the only speaker. But then came the day he fell ill. It wasn't sudden, but it hit hard. We found out that he had cancer. He didn't want to tell me at first. I had to push, had to drag the truth from him, and even then, he didn't want to say much. It was just like before, silent, stoic, as though the whole world didn't need to know what he was feeling. My mother, of course, was devastated. She had a right to be, but there was something about my father's quiet acceptance of his fate that unsettled me. How could he be so calm? How could he not be angry or scared? But when someone you love is sick, you don't have the luxury of questioning their emotions. You just go through the motions, trying to hold on to what's left. I spent days by his side, sitting in his room, talking to him, offering comfort in whatever way I could, but it felt empty. We were there, but we weren't really connecting. I would try to get him to open up, to tell me about his fears, about what he was feeling, but he would just give me one of those smiles that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile that told me he was shutting me out. As the months passed, I grew more and more desperate for him to open up. I wanted to know him better, to understand what he had been through, but he never did. He never shared anything with me that went beyond the surface. He just let me take care of him, and I did. I thought that was enough. I thought I was doing everything I could, that we were having the moments I had longed for. But in the back of my mind, I knew I wasn't truly getting through to him. He had something locked away, and I didn't know how to break down that wall. And then, after he passed away, when everything was still and the house felt like it belonged to someone else, I found the box that changed everything. It wasn't something I was looking for, not at first, but I stumbled across it while going through his things. The lid was old, cracked, and covered with dust. I opened it, half expecting to find old family photographs or letters he had written to my mother, but inside, there were dozens of letters addressed to someone I had never heard of. Letters written in my father's handwriting, letters that spoke of things I never could have imagined. Things he had kept hidden from us all. I didn't know it at the time, but that box would be the key to unlocking the man my father truly was. The man I thought I knew, the man I thought I had spent my life with, was more complicated than I could have ever imagined, and when I began reading those letters, I realized I hadn't really known him at all. The first few days after the funeral were a haze of numbness. I was busy, too busy to think, really. The phone calls, the people coming over, the visits from family, and the quiet conversations between my mother and me. It all felt like a blur. Everyone around me was grieving, each in their own way, but no one talked about my father like I did. No one seemed to see the cracks in the picture the way I did. They all held on to the image of the strong, reliable man, the father and husband who had always been steady, dependable, but never too emotional. My father had been a man of few words, but I always believed that his silence spoke volumes. I thought it was just who he was, and maybe that's why I never questioned it. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his death, the silence felt different. It felt louder, more pressing, more urgent. There was this strange emptiness hanging over the house, an absence that hadn't been there before. It was as if the house itself mourned for him, even though it was full of memories of him. His old chair still sat in the corner of the living room, the one he always used to sink into after a long day at work. The kitchen table was still set, as though he'd be coming in any moment, his boots scraping across the floor as he made his way to his usual spot. But he didn't. And now I couldn't help but look at every corner of the house and see his absence. When I closed my eyes, all I could see was the look on his face during his final days. His expression had been unreadable, as if he was deep in thought about something he wasn't telling me. And that bothered me more than anything. My father had always been strong. He had always been silent, yes, but he had never been distant. He'd always been there. But now, I was haunted by the feeling that there was something I had missed, something he hadn't been able to share with me before it was too late. I remember standing in the hallway, glancing at the door to his study. It was locked now, a final reminder that he wasn't around to open it for me anymore. It had been his space, a room he rarely let anyone into, including my mother. I knew he had books in there, old tools, maybe even papers from his work. But there was something else in there, something I had always felt but never acknowledged, a part of him that was completely hidden from everyone. No one ever asked questions. It wasn't in our family's nature to dig too deep into one another's private lives. We simply accepted what was given. But now that he was gone, I couldn't stop asking myself, what was he hiding? And that's when I found the box. It had been tucked away in the attic, under a pile of blankets, a box that was far older than any of the things we had kept after moving into this house. At first, I thought it was just more clutter. But something about it stood out. Something about the way it was so carefully hidden made my pulse quicken. I could feel that familiar, unsettling feeling again, the one I had when I had tried to get him to open up during his last days. Only this time, I wasn't going to be ignored. I sat down on the floor, the box resting in front of me. It was a small, plain cardboard box, the kind you would see in any office. The top was taped up, the edges worn from years of being tucked away. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the moment I touched it, I knew it was important. There was something about the way it was hidden that made my heart beat faster. It was as if it was waiting for me to uncover it. Slowly, I peeled the tape away and opened the lid. Inside, I found a stack of papers, letters, old, yellowed, and fragile. I held them in my hands, unsure of what to do. The writing on the outside of the envelope caught my attention immediately. It was my father's handwriting, but it wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to anyone I recognized. My fingers trembled as I opened the first letter. The ink had faded with time, but the words were still legible. It was a letter, a confession, one I never expected to find. A side of my father I never knew existed. The letter began with words of love, words written to someone I had never heard of, someone whose name meant nothing to me. But my father's words, his voice, were unmistakable. He spoke of a time long before I had come into the picture, a time when he was a different man. A man with dreams, with desires, with a life that had nothing to do with the family I knew. The first letter was full of longing, regret, and love. But there was something in it that made me pause, something that seemed off. As I continued reading, it became clear that this wasn't just some lost love from his youth. It was a relationship he had kept hidden from everyone, even my mother. The words painted a picture of a life that had been lived in secret, a life full of passion and promise, but also one full of mistakes and choices that led him down a path he would later regret. The more I read, the more I uncovered. This person, this woman, wasn't just an old flame. She was someone who had mattered to him in a way I couldn't comprehend. There were mentions of plans, of things he had promised her, things he had intended to do that never came to fruition. But the most startling revelation was the mention of a child, my half-sibling, a child he had fathered, a child I had never known about. The letter hinted at things I couldn't even begin to process. What kind of man hides that kind of secret? What kind of man hides a part of his life, a part of his heart, from his own family? My hands began to shake as I read on. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing to catch up with what I was learning. How could he have kept this from us? From me? From my mother? The lies, the secrets, the hidden family. It was all too much to bear. The man I thought I knew, the father I had always looked up to, the man who had worked so hard to provide for us, had been living a double life. He had been carrying around this burden of guilt and secrecy, and I never once suspected it. I never even thought to look. I pulled out another letter, and then another. The more I read, the clearer it became. My father had been caught between two worlds, one of love, family, and duty, and another of unspoken regret, guilt, and a life that he could never return to. Each letter was like a window into his soul, a glimpse of the man behind the mask I had always seen. What was the cost of all this secrecy? I thought about my mother. I thought about how she had loved him, trusted him. How could he have kept something so monumental from her? And how could I, his own child, have been so blind to it all? There were things in those letters I couldn't understand. There were things that were too painful to even consider. And yet, I couldn't stop reading. I had to know. I had to understand. The final letter, the one at the bottom of the box, was different. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was just a note, written by my father, but for no one. It spoke of a promise he had made, one that he would never break, no matter how hard it was. It was the kind of promise that could only be made in the depths of regret, the kind of promise that would shape the rest of his life. And in those words, I found the key to everything. The reason he had kept this secret, the reason he had never told anyone. It wasn't because he didn't love us. It was because he had loved someone else too deeply, and the weight of that love, and the mistakes that came with it, was something he could never share. Not with my mother, not with me, and certainly not with anyone else. The letters weren't just a revelation, they were a confession from a man who had lived a life in the shadows, who had kept a piece of himself hidden from everyone he loved. And now, I was left with this burden, the truth, my father's secret, his pain, his love. The truth had been there, waiting for me all along, and now that I knew it, there was no going back. The air in the room felt heavier as I sat there with the final letter in my hands, my fingers gripping the edges, my heart pounding. The words in my father's handwriting seemed to blur together as I read, each sentence pushing me deeper into a labyrinth of confusion, pain, and disbelief. I had thought I knew everything there was to know about him, about our family, but in that moment, everything was unraveling in front of me. I wasn't prepared for the magnitude of what I was about to learn. I thought I was ready, but how could I be? How could anyone ever be ready to face the kind of truth my father had kept buried for so long? The letter didn't just contain a confession. It was more than an apology. It was the rawest, most vulnerable part of him, a side I had never seen before. And it shattered the image I had of the father I had always known. I had spent my life looking up to him, believing that his quiet strength was the measure of his character. But as I read these words, I realized just how much of that strength had been forged in silence that had been protecting us from a past none of us could have imagined. I tried to steady my breath as I leaned back, sinking deeper into the couch, the letter still in my hands. The air in the room felt thick, like I was suffocating under the weight of my father's secrets. I needed to process this. I needed time to understand, to make sense of the flood of emotions crashing over me. But there was no time for that. There was only the truth, and it was as if it had a life of its own, forcing its way into my consciousness. The letter started with a simple, familiar line, one I'd heard 100 times in his quiet, understated way. I love you. But the words that followed were anything but simple. My father spoke of how proud he was of me, how he had watched me grow into the person I had become. It was the kind of thing he would have said to me face to face, but it was never said with such honesty before, never with this rawness, never with this heaviness. And then came the revelation that tore through me like a knife. He wrote about a love that had come before me, before the family we had built together, a love he had carried with him, one he never spoke about. He had never been able to let go of her, he confessed. That woman, that other life he had once lived. She was never just a part of his past. She had been a part of his soul. And though he chose my mother, though he built a life with us, that love had haunted him, followed him, lingered in the corners of his heart, the way a shadow clings to the light. But this wasn't just about a past love. It was so much deeper, so much darker. He confessed for the first time that he had always felt the weight of a decision he made years ago. A decision that, in his mind, was the defining moment of his life. And that decision wasn't just about choosing one woman over another, it was about sacrifice. A sacrifice that had cost him more than I could ever imagine. My father wrote about the pain of never being able to truly be with the person he had loved. How he had kept her a secret. How he had never told my mother, not even once. How that secret had lived within him, growing every year until it had become a part of him that he couldn't escape. The deeper I read, the more I began to see the full picture. My father hadn't just been quiet because he was a man of few words. He had been quiet because of this weight, this deep, unspoken burden he had carried alone. And as I continued, the real revelation hit me like a freight train. He had kept a part of his life from me, a huge part. He had another child, a sibling I never knew existed. My half-sibling. The thought of it sent a sharp pain through my chest. I had a brother or a sister, someone who shared my blood, someone who had grown up with a completely different story, a completely different life, and I had no idea. And my father had kept this from me for years. The letters spoke of a child he had fathered with her, a child that had never been acknowledged, never been part of the family we had built. My heart raced as I tried to comprehend the enormity of it. This was no small secret. This was something that had been buried deep within my father's soul. The more I read, the more the layers of my father's life were peeled away. This wasn't just about love and regret. It was about a hidden family. A child who had grown up with a completely different set of circumstances. A child who had been a part of my father's life, yet I had never known. I had spent so many years believing that the life I shared with my father was the real life, the complete life. But now, as the truth spilled out in front of me, I realized that the reality I had known had only been part of the story. A story I had been given, a version of events shaped by my father's silence, by his unwillingness to burden anyone with the weight of his choices. The worst part of it all? My father had never once planned to tell me. He had carried this secret to his grave, and I was left to uncover it, alone. He had left me to piece together the truth he had hidden for so long. The weight of that hit me like a tidal wave. I had thought I had known everything about him, everything about our family, but this was something I couldn't have prepared myself for. I couldn't have imagined it. My mind began to spin as I read further. The words started to blur. My father confessed that he had thought about telling me, countless times. He had almost told my mother, too. But he hadn't. He had kept his silence, kept the secret to protect us. He thought that if we knew, it would destroy everything. He thought that the truth would tear apart the family he had built, the life he had worked so hard to create. And then came the most painful admission. My father had spent so many years wondering whether or not he had made the right choice, whether he had made the wrong choice in not being with the woman he had loved. He had always felt torn between the life he had chosen and the life he had left behind. The letter ended with a simple statement that made my chest tighten. I am sorry. I have carried this burden for too long, and I don't know how to make it right. But I hope you can understand. I hope you can forgive me. And just like that, it was over. The finality of it hit me harder than anything else. My father was gone. And now, I was left with the truth, his truth, and nothing could ever change it. I closed the letter slowly, as if the act of sealing it away would somehow seal away the storm that had risen in me. But it didn't. The truth was there, hanging in the air, impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to feel. I was angry. I was devastated. I was heartbroken. But most of all, I was lost. I didn't know what to do with all this information. How could I process it all? How could I reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man he had been? How could I ever look at him the same way again? How could I look at my mother the same way? How could I ever look at myself the same way again, knowing that I had a sibling out there that I would never know? The truth had shattered everything, and now there was no going back. The silence in the room felt suffocating. I stared at the box in front of me, the letters neatly folded back inside, their weight pressing down on me in ways I had never imagined. My hands shook as I set the lid back on, but it didn't feel like I was closing anything. It didn't feel like I was closing a chapter of my father's life, or even my own. No, it felt like I was just putting it all away temporarily, like somehow, deep down, I knew I wasn't finished. That the burden of this truth, this burden he had left for me to carry, wasn't something I could just walk away from. But as I sat there, the silence pressing in like a heavy fog, I realized something that cut deeper than the anger, the betrayal, the hurt. My father had never meant for me to find those letters. He had never wanted me to know the truth. His silence, his secrets, had been his way of trying to protect me, trying to shield me from the pain he had carried for years. He had thought it was better to bury it all, to live with the burden himself, than to let it shatter the world we had built together. I felt my chest tighten as I thought about my father. The man I had grown up with, the man I had loved and admired. He wasn't perfect. He had never been perfect, and I had always known that. But this was different. This was something deeper, something I never could have imagined. My father hadn't been hiding his mistakes because he was ashamed of us. He had been hiding them because he was ashamed of himself. He had carried this guilt for so long that it had consumed him, eaten him alive from the inside out. And now, I was left here, with all of it. The truth, his truth, our truth, and I had to figure out what to do with it. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to reconcile the father I thought I knew with the man I had just learned about. But as I sat there, in the stillness of the room, I realized that the process of forgiving him, of forgiving myself, wasn't going to happen all at once. It wasn't something that could be fixed with one conversation, one moment of clarity. It was going to take time. Time to process, time to grieve, and time to understand. I stood up, feeling the weight of the box in my hands as if it were made of stone. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. The sun had begun to set, casting a soft golden light over everything. It was peaceful, still. And for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But I knew I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The truth my father had kept from us wasn't just about him and his mistakes, it was about me, too. It was about my own journey of self-discovery, about the way I had always looked at life through the lens of a child, believing everything was black and white. But life was never that simple. It wasn't about choosing sides or about labeling people as good or bad. My father had been a man of contradictions. He had made mistakes. He had hurt people, including me. But he had also been a man who loved deeply, even if it was in a way that was difficult for me to understand. And then, there was the other part of the story, the part that left me with a strange mix of grief and longing. My half-sibling. I didn't know if they were even alive. I didn't know what they looked like, or how they had grown up. But in that moment, I realized something else. My father's silence had created a rift, not just between him and me, but between me and a person who, for all intents and purposes, was my family. A person I had never even known. I didn't know if I would ever meet them. I didn't know if the world would ever be small enough to bring us together. But I knew one thing. I couldn't change what had already happened. I couldn't change the fact that my father had kept that secret for so long. But I could choose how I responded. I could choose to forgive him, to understand him, and to find peace in the truth that had been buried for so many years. I thought about my mother. She had always been the one who held our family together. She had never once questioned my father, never doubted his love for us. But now, I was left wondering, how would she feel about all of this? How would she handle the truth of the child my father had kept from her? I didn't know the answers. I didn't even know how to begin that conversation. But I knew I couldn't carry this burden alone. It wasn't fair to keep it to myself, to hold on to a truth that had the power to change everything. As the evening wore on, I found myself pacing the living room. I thought about calling my mother, but the words stuck in my throat. What would I even say? How could I explain the pain of discovering something so deep, so personal, about my father and about our family? I didn't know. And then it hit me, my father had carried this burden for so long, but now it was my turn. It was my turn to carry the weight of his mistakes, his choices, and his regrets. It was my turn to find a way to forgive him, to find peace with what I had uncovered. But forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't something that could be forced or rushed. It was a journey, and that journey wasn't going to be easy. I picked up the box again, holding it with both hands. My father's secrets were now my own, and I had to make a decision about how to carry them. Would I let them consume me? Would I let the anger and the betrayal rule my life? Or would I find a way to let go of the past and move forward? The answer wasn't clear. But for the first time since I found those letters, I felt a flicker of hope. Because I knew I had the power to choose. I could choose how to deal with this pain, this truth, this burden. I didn't have to let it define me. And maybe, just maybe, I could start the process of healing. I took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. It wasn't over. The road ahead would be long and filled with difficult moments, but I was ready to face it. I was ready to move forward with the knowledge of my father's secret, knowing that the man I had once idolized was just as human as I am. He had made mistakes. He had lived with regrets. But in the end, he was still my father. And I was still his child. In that moment, I felt something shift within me, a quiet peace that came from the understanding that life isn't perfect. People aren't perfect. And that's okay. My father had made choices. So had I. And now, it was time for me to choose how I wanted to live with the truth. I could carry the burden, or I could let it go. But the power to decide, the power to heal, was in my hands. As I sat in the quiet of the evening, the weight of everything finally began to settle. The house was still, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, the soft whisper of the wind outside. I felt like I had been holding my breath for days, weeks, even years. But in that moment, I finally let it out slowly, carefully, as though the very act of breathing again was a decision I needed to make. I stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the night had fallen completely, the sky a deep navy blue, the stars scattered across it like tiny pinpricks of light. It was beautiful, almost peaceful. And yet, as I stood there, staring out into the vast expanse of the world beyond, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something new, something that wasn't defined by the past but shaped by it. My father's secrets had become my own, but the truth I had uncovered, no matter how painful, had also given me the chance to rebuild, to find a new way forward, even if that path was still unclear. I thought about him. I thought about the man I had spent my whole life with, the man who had been so steady, so solid. But now, I saw him differently. I saw him not as a hero, not as the perfect father I had always imagined him to be, but as someone who had been just as flawed, just as human as I am. Someone who had loved, who had made mistakes, who had kept parts of himself hidden from the world out of fear, out of shame, and maybe, in his own way, out of love. I thought about how he had kept that burden to himself, how he had carried it for years, never once sharing it with anyone. I had spent so much time wishing he had been different, wishing he had opened up to me, wishing he had been the kind of father who shared everything. But in the quiet of that moment, I realized that his silence had been a shield, a way to protect us all from the weight of his regrets. And maybe that was his way of showing love. Maybe he had tried to protect me from the truth because he didn't want to see me hurt the way he had been. The thought was both heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. It was strange, isn't it? To finally see someone for who they truly are, both the good and the bad, and to realize that they're still the same person you loved, even if they're not who you thought they were. My father had never been perfect, but neither was I. None of us were, and yet that imperfection made him real, made him human. I turned away from the window and walked toward the box, the letters still sitting there. I had spent days reading them, trying to piece together the fragments of his life, trying to make sense of it all. But now, I understood. I didn't need to know every detail. I didn't need to understand every choice he had made. What I needed to know was this: my father had lived a life filled with love and pain, with mistakes and sacrifices, but he had also loved me, and that love, no matter how complicated it was enough. I picked up the box and carried it over to the bookshelf, where I had placed other memories of my father, old pictures, trinkets from trips we had taken, small tokens that held meaning. I placed the box there, alongside everything else that represented him, and closed the door gently. It wasn't about forgetting the truth I had uncovered. It wasn't about pretending the past hadn't happened. It was about moving forward, about accepting that my father's life, like all lives, was made up of so many layers, some beautiful, some painful, but all important. And maybe, just maybe, that's how life works. We spend so much time looking for answers, searching for the things that will make sense of it all. But sometimes, the answer isn't found in the truth itself. It's found in how we choose to live with it, in how we choose to let it shape us, how we choose to grow from it. I thought about my mother, too. I hadn't spoken to her about the letters yet. I wasn't sure I was ready to. How could I even begin to explain all of this to her? But I knew that, like me, she had lived with the man I thought I knew. She had loved him with all her heart, and she had trusted him completely. And now, like me, she would have to reconcile the person she had loved with the person who had kept so much from her. I didn't know how she would handle it. I didn't know how I would either. But the one thing I did know was this: I couldn't carry this truth alone. Not anymore. I had to tell her. I had to give her the space to grieve, to understand, and to process everything the way I had. We had to face this together, even if it was painful, even if it tore open wounds that had long been healed. Because in the end, that was the only way forward. Not through silence, not through hiding, but through truth, through sharing. And as for me, I was starting to understand that the past didn't define me. It didn't define my father either. It was a part of us, yes, but it wasn't the whole of us. What mattered was how we moved forward from here. What mattered was how we learned from the pain, how we chose to heal. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't have the perfect plan for what would come next. But for the first time since I found those letters, I felt a sense of peace. It was small, quiet, but it was there. And I knew that peace would grow as long as I allowed it to. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle into me. The truth had changed everything, but it hadn't destroyed me. It hadn't destroyed us. We were still here. We were still a family. And that, I realized, was the most important thing of all. I took a deep breath and walked over to the phone. It was time to call my mother. It was time to share this truth with her, to let her know what I had learned, and to give her the space to understand it in her own way. We had been through so much together, and this was just another chapter in our story, one we would face together. As I dialed her number, I realized that maybe the most important thing I had learned from all of this wasn't the secret my father had kept. It wasn't the betrayal, the heartbreak, or even the anger I had felt. It was that love, in its most complicated form, is still love. And sometimes, the people we love the most are the ones who teach us the hardest lessons. The phone rang, and as I waited for her to pick up, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. No matter what happened next, I knew that I had faced the truth, and that, in itself, was enough.